And thank you everybody for inviting me to speak at the Communist University again. This is a subject which has dominated, how can we put it, theoretical debate among Marxists and those who oppose Marx's theory over several decades now, and in fact over the last century. So it's a subject which is a little bit abstruse and theoretical, but it does have some important impact and consequences once we clarify what we mean by this so-called transformation problem. In order to help the discussion, I'm going to present you some slides. Mike Roberts always does slides. So I will now try to share the screen and then we can see where we can go from there. So the so-called transformation problem. Let's start first of all, and we have been doing that in previous sessions, to remind ourselves that Marx's theory of value, which is what we're talking about here, the transformation of values into prices. We're talking about what we have prices in the market for different goods and services. The basic theory of explaining those prices from a Marxist point of view is that they depend on how much, on average, labor time is expended on the goods and services that are produced and sold on the market. What is socially necessary and what is the average labor time in order to produce those goods and services. So Marx starts from the view that value and price and the law of value depends on the expenditure of labor time and workers going to work, if you like. The famous, simple, self-evident quote that every child knows a nation which ceased to work, I will not say for a year, but even for a few weeks would perish. So every child knows that the masses of products corresponding to the different needs require different and quantitatively determined masses of total labor of society. And a scientific analysis consists precisely in demonstrating how this law based on labor power and labor, asserts itself in the market. Now that position, which is also held broadly by the classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, has subsequently been denied, condemned and regarded as irrelevant by mainstream economics. And from the very beginning, when the law of value was presented in that form in Capital Volume 1, and an explanation of how that related to prices in the markets, as explained in Volume 3, has been attacked and criticized by those in the mainstream and bourgeois economists. The transformation problem, according to these bourgeois economists, is how do we explain the values based on labor time turning out to be the market prices in the market, or from that matter, looking at it from the other way, how do we explain that the prices in the market are related to the amount of labor time involved in them? Because clearly they are not directly in relation, because if one producer, whether it's a capitalist and his workers, takes 16 hours to produce one particular product, and another producer takes 8 hours to produce a product, the same product, exactly the same product, but on the market the price is the same, how can the value in labor time be related to the price in the market? Because clearly in the case of the first capitalist, they're taking longer maybe than the other capitalist, and yet there's an equal price. So clearly value or prices measured in labor time do not match up. And this was the basic criticism of von der Werk, an Austrian economist, in the end of the 19th century. He claimed that there's a basic error in Marx's system because the market prices of commodities are not directly related to the values measured in labor time. And he criticized Marx's solution in Volume 3 of Capital, which he said did not prove through that prices and values in labor time were related in any particular way. That was taken to a further extreme in the 20th century by the Keynesian and mainstream economists of the 1950s and 60s, Paul Samuelson, who said, well, what? Because there's no relation between prices in the market and the value in labor time of commodities, then we don't really need this labor theory of value. We can rely on prices in the market as being our best measure of the worth of any commodity that is being produced. The truth has been laid bare, said Paul Samuelson, stripped of logical complication and confusion, apparently caused by Marxist theory, then anybody's method of solving the famous transformation problem is seen to involve returning from an unnecessary detour, going into labor and then back to prices. Such a transformation is precisely like that which an eraser used to rub out an earlier entry. In other words, we can rub out value, after which we can make a new start and end up with a properly calculated entry, namely price. So if you want to know what where a price of a commodity is, according to Samuelson, why is a motor car at £30,000 to buy? Why is a piece of paper just 1 penny? It's not to do with anything to do with the average labor time involved in either of those products. It's simply that the price is set in the market for £30,000 for a car and only 1p for a piece of paper, and that's all you need to know. You don't need to go through this detour back into labor and then back into prices. It's an irrelevance, according to Samuelson. Because the argument is individual prices diverge from individual values, as I showed. One capitalist may take a longer time than another capitalist to produce the same product, but we end up with a price in the market, assuming it's relatively competitive, that is an average for everybody. That's the price the consumer pays, however long one capitalist takes to produce it with his workers, and another one takes a different time. But as Fred Mosley, Marxist economist, said, if you accept Samuelson's interpretation of the transformation of values into prices, then values do in fact cancel out and play no role in determination in prices. However, it is not Marx's theory. Individual values are not converted into individual prices of production. Individual values play no role in Marx's theory of prices. Prices of production, in Marxist terms, are not determined by multiplying all the individual values in labor time for each commodity to come up with an individual price from individual values. It's not a multiplication of various individual values to get individual prices. Marxist theory says that the total value in labor time in an economy measured in socially necessary labor time will equal the total prices of all the commodities. All that happens when capitalists compete with each other is that this total surplus value that's extracted from the workers in aggregate is redistributed in total profit among capitals according to their size. So price is connected to value and surplus value is connected to profit, but in total. But they will differ in individual sectors of the market and for individual commodities, but overall they will equalize. And as Andrew Clymer said, the essence of his solution is that the total amount of profit in the economy is the same when prices adjust to equalize the rates of profit as when they reflect the commodity's actual values. That's the amount of labor required to produce it. So the total profit is simply distributed differently. Accordingly, the total amount of sales revenues received in the economy, so the total price, if you like, is also unchanged. It's merely distributed in a different amount as a result of competition to equalize profitability across the board between capitalists. So although the law of value would seem to be falsified, if we were to confine our attention to individual industries, it holds true as a law pertaining to the aggregate economy. So let us just consider Marx's solution to this question. First, profit comes from the exploitation of labor and then is redistributed, transformed through the branches of capital and competition and the market into prices of production. How does that transformation take place? Well, the surplus value or profit achieved by each individual capitalist workforce does not come back directly to the individual capitalist. Each capitalist competes in the market to sell its commodities, and that competition leads to profits being redistributed. because profits tend to an average rate per unit of capital invested through the market. So the transformation of values created by labor into prices in the market means that individual prices will differ from individual values because there is an average rate of profit, but there's a certain difference in the amount of investment and in labor time that each capitalist is making. So the surplus value is transferred on the whole from technically less advanced branches to technically more advanced branches. In this way, the transfer of surplus value between different branches, far from being in contradiction with the value, is simply precisely how capitalism competition works according to a modern capitalist economy. And in fact, we know empirically that there isn't a great deal of difference between individual values and individual prices, particularly, and it's certainly little or no difference when we measure it empirically between total value and total prices. A number of scholars have worked that out. They've shown that in aggregate, total value is pretty close to total prices measured in money terms. And therefore, Marx's transformation of value into prices is not irrelevant, even to relative price determination. In fact, it is empirically supported. Let's go through the position of Marx's transformation as he presented it in volume 3. It's not exactly the same data, but it takes 5 sectors. And he says, look, take sector 1. It's a very highly technologically superior sector or capitalist. It's got 80 in machinery, constant capital, only 20 against labor. So it's got 4 times as much in value terms than labor. And given that we assume that the rate of surplus value or exploitation is the same for each of these sectors, then the total amount of value produced in sector 1 is 120. If you go down to sector 5, which is the most backward sector of capitalists, they've got the least amount of investment in technology and machinery and the greatest share invested in just employing labor. With 100% rate of surplus value, that means that they produce a value of 180. But what happens in a capitalist competition between these 5 sectors is that there's a tendency towards averaging the rate of profit across the board. And you can see that if we aggregate all the total value and all the total sectors together on the bottom line, we can work out an average rate of profit, which is 49. I can't quite see it on my screen, but I think that's right. So that if you take sector 1 now, and we've got averaged the profit rate across the board. So sector 1 still has 80 in investment in machinery and 20 in value, but it's now able to receive a rate of profit of 49% on its 100 investment. So the total price, if you like, for that in price terms now, in value terms, is, because it's the same thing for the capitalist, is 149. So that capitalist, because it's technologically more superior, took the only labor time of 120 to produce the commodity that they're all producing. But because of the equalization of the rate of profit in competition, it actually gets an increase in the total value because of its technological advantage. In fact, it gets an increase of 149 minus 120, so 29 extra in value terms. If you go to the bottom line again, we see an average here. So the total average again was 49% for the rate of profit. So this capitalist has got 80 and 20 and now only 49 as their profit has been averaged. And so it ends up with a total price of 149, but that's a reduction from what it had before in terms of the value it produced, 180. So the most technologically superior sector has gained because of the competition in the market, because it's been able to produce things more quickly in labor time terms. And there's been a transfer of surplus value, the total surplus value from the weaker sectors, the less developed technological sectors, and that the bottom sector here has lost actually 31 in value terms, while the top sector has gained 29. And working it across the board, you'll find that equalizes out. And what you find is that the total value in aggregate terms is still 730, and the total price is still 730. The total surplus value is 240, and the total surplus value in prices terms is still 240. All that's happened is there's been a redistribution of the surplus value, this line here, into profits because of the equalization of the profit rate, and the result is a transfer of parts of the surplus value from the less technologically developed sectors to the more technologically developed sectors. That's the fundamental explanation of the transformation of prices into value. So each sector has a different price from its value in labor terms, but that does not mean that it's still not related to value in terms of labor. And it is, because there's total value in labor time is still the same as the total value in price. So that's how Marx explains the process of the connection between the prices of production, and therefore market prices, and value in labor time. So transformation means redistribution. As we've seen, the total value is 730, it equals the total prices of 730, but in individual capital have commodities with different values to different prices because of the redistribution of surplus value into profits by the market. And as Marx says, although the capitalists in different spheres of production get back on the sale of their commodities the capital values consumed to produce them, namely the cost price, so they're still getting in value terms and in price terms what they spent and invested on machinery and labor. They do not secure the surplus value and therefore the profit that is produced in their own sphere in connection with the production of commodities. What they secure is only the surplus value, and hence the profit that falls to the share of each part of the total social capital when it's evenly distributed from the total surplus value or profit produced in a given time by the social capital in all the spheres of production. So you will note that in that explanation, there is no transformation of values into prices in any way between the constant and variable capitals, because they are already transformed in the previous production period. This is a key point. But the C and the V that we saw, and I'll just go back briefly to show you, if I can find it. No, I'm getting the wrong way. Yeah, so if you look at this, you'll see that the C and the V there in value terms is 80 and 20, and in price terms it's 80 and 20. There's no change in that. The only change going on is the redistribution of surplus value in each sector based on a competition and the equalization of profit to produce a different rate, a different amount for profit or surplus value, redistribution of that, but no change in C and V. And this is very important because it means that this will explain much better the argument that is then presented against the transformation that Marx has explained by later economists like Ladislav Boltowicz and Piero Sraffa, the so-called neo-Ricardians. Boltowicz argues that Marx has a logical inconsistency in his transformation. He calculates inputs in values and outputs in prices of production, but he omits the feedback effect of the latter. In other words, why didn't his converted surplus value into profit? Why didn't he convert the constant capital and the variable capital in price terms? They were originally in value terms. He should have converted those as well. So the values of constant and variable capital must also be converted into prices of production. If you do that simultaneously, then Marx's solution fails. There is no transformation. Total values no longer equal total prices. Total surplus value no longer equals total profit. And therefore, the rate of profit itself is indeterminate, because this is simultaneous equation of changing the inputs as well as the outputs leads to an indeterminate result, and you don't know what is determining the rate of profit. Similarly, Piero Sraffa makes the same argument and then says we should, again, like Samuelson and others, do away with value and conduct the whole capitalist process in physical inputs and outputs. So you've got so many goods that are in raw materials and labor, and then you produce outputs and you compare the two physically. Of course, if you think about it, you can't compare anything physically except in money terms. You can only compare things in money terms, and you cannot compare them in physical terms. And there's a fundamental logical inconsistency in Sraffa's book, a title of which I show you there, The Production of Commodities by the Means of Commodities. Commodities defined in physical terms are all different. If I have a piece of steel or a pile of steel, and then I convert it into a car, that are two different commodities. How do I know what the relationship is in value terms? I can't know that in physical terms. We need a way in which we can analyze every different commodity, every individual commodity in its concrete terms, in a way that's abstracted from their physical attributes and give us a general view of the measure. That basic abstraction is abstract labor measured in labor time, which Marx has come up with. Sraffa wants to do away with that because he accepts Borkowicz's argument that if you convert values in labor time, both not just the surplus value, but also the constant variable capital in the transformation, then you end up with sort of simultaneously with prices and values which are not determinate. And you cannot measure values and connect them to prices, and you cannot connect surplus value directly to total profit, and therefore you have an indeterminate rate of profit. This is the transformation problem of the post-war period, which was taken up by the neo-Ricardians like Sraffa and others, and they claimed that this was a devastating critique of Marx's explanation of how the labor time and labor theory connects to prices in the market. And therefore Marx's theory of profitability and value in labor time falls apart. This confounded most Marxist economists for decades, many of them accepting Borkowicz and Sraffa's explanation and the neo-Ricardian criticism. Why is it neo-Ricardian? Because Ricardo didn't have a view of how you could not line up values and prices together. In his view, you couldn't get two connections together, and he said it was an impossible task. So the neo-Ricardians say, yes, Ricardo was right, and Marx was wrong to try and suggest it could be done in labor terms. What's the answer to this? Well, the answer has been, in the last 20 or 30 years, it's spelt out very clearly by a series of Marxist economists, and it's called, in my view, the temporal response. The Borkowicz simultaneous feedback solution is unrealistic and unnecessary. Think about it. He's saying that the capitalists have got some machinery, they've got raw materials, and they've got labor. It's measured in money, if you like. They made that investment. They put labor to work, workers to work. They produce a new commodity. Out of that, surplus value is produced over and above what the capitalists have spent on workers. And in labor time, an extra amount of labor time is now incorporated into the commodity and not paid out to the workers, and the capitalists can make a profit. But what we're saying here is that before that process begins, the process of production to create more new value and surplus value, already the money has been spent on the constant capital, on the machinery, and on the labor. There is no need to go back and change the prices of what was already being bought in a certain price in a previous time frame before we started the price of production, in order to try and achieve the change from values to prices. Borkowicz and the neo-Ricardians attempt to revise the value or the prices of production that already have been established for constant capital and variable capital, as you saw in Marx's theory, is unnecessary and it's unrealistic. How can the price, if I buy a pile of steel or a machine at a certain price at the beginning of this year, say, and then I put it to work through this year, I don't go back and change the price that I've already paid for that commodity, the machinery and the raw materials at the beginning. That's gone. That's fixed historically. And to suggest that we need to change that price because of the process of changing the redistribution and the value of what's gone on in production over the next year is both unrealistic and also unnecessary. So the equalization of the rate of profit is already being achieved, first of the inputs, and then secondly, in a new period of time, in the new production process for the outputs that we're now applying. So Marx's transformation is temporal. You start with a given money capital to invest in plant, machinery, and labor, if you like in time series 1, and you get a new value created by the exertion and exploitation of worker in this second period. The surplus value comes after the covering the cost of capital and constant and variable capital. This is then redistributed into competition in the market, which drives all capitals towards an average rate of profit, as Marx showed in his transformation model. So there's no need to transform the values of constant capital and variable capital into prices. They are already given as prices from the market in the previous process of production. The only transformation that takes place is the transformation of the total new value in the production process in a redistribution through market competition, with profits going to the various capitalists depending on the size of capital each advanced in the start of production. That brings me to a further critique, which I think we can also answer. Noshiro Okishio, a Japanese Marxist economist in the 1960s, argued that accepting the neoliberal view, that why would any capitalist invest in new machinery and employ labor unless he could increase his rate of profit? What would be the point of investing unless profitability rises? So how can we talk about, as Marx does in volume 3, having got a general and average rate of profit and prices of production, about a tendency to the rate of profit to fall? Akishio says no individual capitalist would introduce a new technology unless it contributed to raising profits and market share, and thus the rate of profit. So the law of the tendency of the rate of profit fall is ridiculous, because really capitalists are looking to raise profitability, otherwise they wouldn't invest. So the reply to this is very simple. The innovating capitalist, yes, will apply a new technology if it steals a march on others through lowering the cost of production against the prevailing market price. So its profits go up, as we saw the advanced, technologically advanced capitalist in sector 1 in Marxist transformation can gain advantage because it can get a redistribution of profit to it from the less effective, less technologically developed capitalists. So its profits go up. But that is being achieved, Marx would say, not as Akishio says, by the profits of the other capitalists falling as they lose competitive advantage. There's a competition between individual capitalists, and that causes a redistribution of the surplus value. It's not one capitalist gaining a profit by reducing the amount of labor time and selling on the market. There's a competition going on between different capitalists, some more technologically advanced than the others. Now, the others must react by introducing the same new technology or an even better technology that lowers their costs too. But the productivity of the reduced labor force for all the capitalists will rise, but because there's a reduced labor force, more investment in machinery as opposed to labor power, that will tend to lower the value in labor time per unit of production, and therefore lower the overall rate of profit. So once all the capitalists have adopted the new technology and the organic composition of capital, which is the ratio of money spent on equipment versus wages, will have risen, then other things being equal, the general rate of profit will fall. And the mistake that is being made by Akishio and by the simultaneous equation theories of the neo-Ricardians is a fallacy of composition. The Akishio theory is an example of this. It simply sums the gain of one individual capitalist and applies it to the whole capitalist economy. Well, what seems good for one individual capitalist is not good for the profitability of the whole capitalist economy necessarily, because when everybody does it, then the overall profitability will fall if there's been an increase in the organic composition of capital and it has not been counteracted by a rise in the amount of surplus value relative to what's been spent, namely the rate of exploitation. Moreover, each individual capitalist is not doing this voluntarily, as Akishio suggests, but of the necessity to compete and not lose market share. The whole point is that capitalists are competing against each other. They have to go into this process of trying to expand their constant capital, raise the organic composition of capital, improve their technological, and lower the amount of time spent and production and costs spent in producing the commodities that they're competing with others in. And so they have to do that, otherwise they will lose market share. Everybody's competing to do that. As Marx says, the law of value and profitability operates behind the backs of the capitalists, not in their conscious control. So let us just summarize this so-called transformation problem. What does it matter? This sounds like a technical matter that's not very important. Well, we need a theory of value. As I said, we have to explain how the capitalist system works, where profit comes from, what is the nature of exploitation, and what perhaps is just as much, we need a value, an explanation of what something's worth. We can't just measure it in terms of if you've got, it's worth more because there's more tons of steel or there's more energy involved. We need a general theory which can abstract across different commodities and explain why some are at a certain price and others are not. And we need an objective theory. The mainstream theory is that what decides the price of a commodity in the market is the demand for it. But that is not an explanation at all, because it's really, but everybody's demand and need for a product is different. You cannot abstract between different individual subjective views about what they think something is worth. And you can't aggregate those subjective views into one overall view to explain the price of a commodity. But you can abstract labor time and the different amounts of labor time that are going into production of something and come up with an abstract labor time which gives you a general measure of prices in the market. And that's the key for a theory of value that works. We need to show how prices in the market are connected to labor time spent by workers in producing them. And that's what Marx's theory of value does. And it does, as I've tried to show, relate prices in the market to the average labor time produced by workers to make the commodities in those markets. The need to show also that profit comes from surplus value, because what this shows, the transformation thing is it shows that when we look at profit in the newspapers and measure it and so on, we know, we can work out, we can see that all profit must come from the extraction of surplus value, the exploitation of workers, and not from anywhere else. It might appear to come from anywhere else, but in the end, it must come from the extraction of surplus value from workers, and that produces profit. Redistributed that surplus value in many ways, not only between capitalists competing in production, but also extraction of some of that surplus value to the bankers in interest, to landlords in rent, to financial speculation, and so on. So the relation of the transformation of individual rates of profit into a general rate of profit helps us and helps Marx to be able to start from the point of view of arguing that the aggregate of a total economy, it provides support for his later arguments in volume 3 of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, because we have a general rate of profit which is determinate and if related to the labor theory of value, then the law of tendency of the rate of profit follows, because that depends also on the fact that only value is created by the expenditure of labor time by workers, and that is then extracted in the form of surplus value. And it's the process of value in general which leads us to explain why the law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall is not only theoretically consistent and logical, but also empirically supported. So that's why it matters. That's why an explanation of this transformation that Marx explains in volume 3 is important, and the refutation of the criticisms are therefore also important.